Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very accomplished and respected individual from Columbia University, New York, USA, Mr. Adam Stepan, PhD.
Well, Ashutosh, thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Adam is the director of the Picker Center Digital Education Group, and he's an author, he's a co-author of a book titled Leveling the Learning Curve. So, Adam, before we talk about digital education, tell me about your journey, transition from an Emmy award-winning documentary producer to a leader in digital education.
Well, it's been interesting, and I think it parallels maybe some of the changes and the pivots that many people around the world are doing with the growth of digital technology. So I currently work at Columbia University, and I've been there for 10 years, and it's been a very exciting time with a lot of innovation, a lot of things happening in the digital education space. And I think that the connection between digital learning and film and television, is for me is a very natural one. I grew up, watching PBS television, and my mom's English. In the UK, they had something called Open University. I remember visiting England and seeing that. Wow, these are really pretty good online, the equivalent of online classes. And this is back in the 70s and 80s. So I think this question of how you could use media to share knowledge has always been connected to some degree. And I think it was really in the early 2000s that the technology allowed things like this to happen. They allowed us to, to record video, to share video. And so I think I saw TED Talks first. I was very struck. I say, wow, this is, when I was growing up, you only had a few outlets on television. You had National Geographic of the US and PBS that would allow for more serious discussion about complex issues. And suddenly TED Talks opened the door to all of this creation, sharing of information and projects like this one. And so I think it's been a journey in the last 10 years as universities think about how can they do this, how can they not undermine their core model of teaching in person, but add these extra elements, because obviously young people today live in a digital world. They get a lot of their information from the web and from videos. So I think that's where perhaps bringing some of the tools of documentary film and other types of media and production come into play.
Fascinating. So let's talk about digital education now. What are some of the parameters that define digital education? And are these different in different countries?
Well, I think, the pandemic obviously changed the equation for a lot of people. I think there was a lot of exciting things happening in digital education. What people think of now as Coursera and edX, they were called MOOCs when they came out, caused a huge scandal. It was seen as, in 2013, 2014, it was seen as the new technology that was going to disrupt higher education in the way that other types of technologies that disrupted things like print journalism or taxi service by Uber or all those other disruptions. And it didn't quite happen. And I think so I think that there was a feeling that, okay, well, in fact, digital tools aren't maybe that useful. There was a lot of things happening at big public universities. So there was a real distinction in people's mind between sort of online education, which was seen as sort of a cheaper alternative to quote unquote real education that most people felt had to happen in person in the classroom. And then I think with the pandemic, people were forced online. A lot of what happened was very bad. It wasn't well done. I mean, the core lesson that we have in our book and that we take away from all the interviews and research is that digital education can happen well if it's planned, if it's intentional. And so obviously in a pandemic where you have to go online, overnight, that didn't happen. But I think people are coming away from that experience realizing that it's not this either or choice, that actually you can enhance in-person learning by putting things online, and that by offering flexibility, you can invite in new learners. Adults who have careers can continue to grow and learn new things that the world needs them to know. So I think that there's this understanding now that it's a much more of a complex spectrum of options.
Fascinating. And, based on all the work that you've done in the area of digital education, What are some of the misconceptions you have encountered about digital education?
Well, I think for many, like I said, for many years, people felt it was there was the world of online education
Mm,
or serious in-person learning. And I
correct.
think that dichotomy, people have now realized that's not the case,
Mm,
and that actually you can have really rich learning experiences, including on things that you wouldn't think you could teach
mm,
online, liberal arts,
mm,
discussions. There's actually a lot of writing that happens online. And so I think that is one of the biggest things that people are now waking up to.
mm,
And I think the question really is what are the little adjustments that universities need to make
mm,
to provide the support and also the incentives? Because I think most professors around the world are very overburdened. It's a it's there's the course loads keep on increasing. It's not so. I think often in the past, the digital education has been this afterthought or something that people were asked to do as as a voluntary extra thing. And I
mm,
think so. The question is just how can we make it baked into our plans to really incentivize professors
mm.
to provide students with the experiences they really want.
Very interesting. And when I was reading about you and preparing to, for this conversation, I was fascinated that you prepare a lot of digital case studies, for different markets. How do you ensure that these digital case studies are uh, understood and equally relevant across the digital and the global audience?
Well, it's a fantastic question. I mean, so the core idea of digital case study essentially, I mean, the case method has been a big part of
Mm,
learning for a while. You know, law schools, business schools use cases. If you're going to try to take theory, and when you actually try to take a theory and apply it in the messy reality of the real world,
mm,
that's where I think a lot of learning happens. Where
right.
something, so I think that question of providing students with a case study
Mm,
and asking them to think about it and apply theory to that specific instance is a really powerful learning device, a thing that's used a lot. So the question is, how can we use video to enhance that?
mm,
And we basically came up with a new format, which is what we call the digital case study, which is not, nothing is invented, everything is
mhm,
copied and adapted.
mm,
So it's a PBS or BBC documentary film,
mm,
about 8 or 12 minutes, combined with a written case. And so what we found is that's very useful, especially with these modern groups of learners where you have people from different diverse backgrounds. We
mm,
do executive education at Columbia. And we have a lot of students who some of them are people like yourself who have a huge experience in industry. Others are perhaps they have advanced degrees, others less so. But when you have a specific case that everyone can focus on, it really drives the debate. So then the question is really how do you get a group of people to understand a very complex local situation? So we make a film, and the rules of the basic, that make good stories, interesting people, a
mm,
problem, some
mm,
action. So if we allow that to happen, and then the other thing is to provide to not to try to provide the answers. The cases are very open-ended. So the idea
mm,
is that you watch the video, you read the document, and then we're not presented a theory or a problem. That's up
mm,
to the students, that's up to the debate. And
mm,
that's so we found that to be very successful. We started off doing these professionally with the same crews we'd hire for PBS or BBC, and
mm.
then now we're actually doing them with students.
Wow. Fascinating. So, Adam, my next question is that as someone who has presented at major teaching and learning events, what are some of the emerging trends in digital education that you are most excited about?
Well, there's a bunch of, it's a time of such rapid change.
Mm,
So obviously artificial intelligence is, in
yeah.
everyone's minds, both from, concern about how it might undermine teaching and grading
Mm,
and assessments, but also trying to understand how can it really be integrated and used.
mm,
Students nowadays are going to live in a world where, for better or worse, artificial intelligence is going to be a big part of all these workflows. So as educators, we have a responsibility to
mm,
get them ready for that. I also think that this artificial intelligence driven world opens up something that we've been talking about for years, which is
mm,
adaptive learning, personalized learning. So if you are somebody who, maybe English is not your first language, or maybe you have a certain needs and disabilities, or perhaps you have a certain educational background and you're looking to learn something, to be able to present to that person a series of learnings that would be adapted to their needs is something that people are working on for literally,
Right.
60 years. But it's
Right.
never really worked very well because the technology is not there. I think now we're very close. So I
Mm.
think that basically, and I think there's also going to be a really exciting explosion of sharing. So right now, if I have two high school age daughters, and watching them through the pandemic, it was very informative because you really, I was writing a book about
Mm.
digital education at the time to see what
Mm.
they were doing, how they were getting their knowledge.
Mm.
And the bottom line is that if you're in a K-12 looking to things at American high school, there's lots and lots of discrete modular things you can find online, videos from Khan Academy or from Class Central or various places, TED
Mm.
Talks. You can find information about something. When you get to higher education, less so, because things have been trapped in
Mm.
MOOCs in a full course. You can't find that fantastic short lecture by a
Mm.
fantastic professor from a university, be it in India or Indiana or
Yeah.
wherever.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be this explosion of sharing of modular assets. And I think AI is going to allow you to suddenly stack them. So I think that this question of that's the big thesis, I think, of our book was that
Mm.
I was very honored to write a book with my colleagues Suleiman Kachani and Dr. William Emick from Columbia. And I
Mm.
think that was one of the big takeaways is that if we're smart about this, we can create assets that would both improve teaching on campus, but
Mm.
also that could be shared. And the new technology would allow this sharing to happen. So that's, I think, the big exciting future is how
Mm.
can this new world of sharing
Mm.
start to happen?
Very interesting. You also have said that you've done some work or study of the Aadhar program in India, which has really been a game changer for all of us because we've got a unique ID now suddenly. But you said that the Aadhar program represents a case study in public sector innovation. What have been some of the lessons you have learned from such a program?
Well, I think I was very honored to actually be in India when Prime Minister Modi was taking was having his first Independence Day speech, and I
Mhm.
remember at the moment the Aadhar program had been actually created by a previous government, and
Yeah.
there was a question whether it would go forward or not. And I thought it was very impressive. They're like in everything, nothing's perfect, but it was a very exciting attempt to say we can use digital tools to really for equity and for access.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big debate in the literature about digital dividends versus digital divides. And I think for a long time people were very focused on digital divides and saying
Yeah.
that a lot of people, especially less fortunate, underserved populations
Mm.
didn't have
Mm.
access to the internet. So that naturally wealthy people would be benefited from a digital transformations. But
Right.
I think evidence actually shows that people are smart and if given an opportunity, everyone, almost everybody has a smartphone nowadays. It's
Mm.
really impressive.
Mm.
And people, if they're given the opportunity, they can figure things out. So I think that actually so the Aadhar program for me, that was one of the big takeaways that if the government should step up and put effort into uh, digitization, getting people online, and there are real digital dividends,
Mm.
especially for less underserved populations. If you do this, there's obviously a lot of problems. So our case study looks
Mm.
at questions of privacy, looks at a lot of the issues around it. But I think it's the sort of thing you're seeing around the world in various ways, and that was a huge example.
Mm. What a great example, and thank you. My next question is that based on, again, the work that you've done, could you share an example of how digital education has transformed a community that you have seen yourself?
Yeah, I think there's so many, and we encourage everyone, of course, to buy our book,
Yep,
Leveling the Learning Curve, on Amazon,
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
explore some of them. We when we're writing the book, we were very lucky to have a chance to talk. It was during the pandemic, so we did over 50 interviews with people both in the United States and Europe and Asia,
Mm.
both from a couple different sectors. So I'll give you a couple examples from
Mhm.
sectors because I think of digital education as something that maybe happens at universities only, but in
Mm.
fact, some of the most exciting examples are happening in the nonprofit sector. So this question of development, the United Nations, for example, the UNDP is a huge agency really focused on helping the world address its major challenges. And so the unit within the UNDP, which does education, of course, before the pandemic, realized that digital tools is the obvious way to connect and train people at scale. And what they also realized that there's a lot of learning that happens in communities, and that they created a whole network of a couple different networks actually, but they wanted to really assess the knowledge of native groups. So they put a huge effort into sending people and to connect to indigenous groups who are often on the front of climate change and problems, and to try to help them tell their stories and also connect them on an online network. And we were at Columbia University. We're very proud to be part of that effort. A lot of our students who trained in a class that we teach on digital storytelling were some of the people who traveled around to over 20 countries as part of that project. And what they've done is created a network of training, because they're training city that they're working both with indigenous groups, but also people in national governments who are working on, again, international climate issues. And it's very technical, complex area. And so there's lots of, there's a lot of deep knowledge needed, but also connections. And what they found is that digital communities are created. So now by being in online discussions and classes together, people from Kenya to South Africa to Brazil to Norway are able to meet, connect, and share ideas and create these, people talk about, a couple different impacts of digital education. They talk about these big hits, like, classes that can be seen by, hundreds of thousands of students because it's a very popular topic. But there's also this idea of long tail, something that's very specific. By putting it out there, you can connect with people who are focusing on that particular issue all around the world. So the UN is one example.
Yeah.
And another one is the Bard College network with Open Society's support, working with refugee camps. So we did. I'm very honored to be part of this project for a couple of years, where we are helping create online classes and sharing content with refugee camps. There's a group of 250,000 refugees in northern Kenya who are generally stateless. They're from Sudan, other areas of conflict. They basically can't leave the camp because they don't have citizenship in any countries. At least they can't go back to their home country. And so by digital education, a lot of them, they can go to a center, they can take online classes, and they can also participate. And so in many ways, the biggest benefactors of that are the other students around the world who get a chance to study with these people and understand, wow, how does the world look to you? And so I think those sort of engagements are very exciting. So those are just a few of the many examples.
Great examples. Thank you. My next question to you is that how important is cultural sensitivity and local context when you are developing digital educational materials for a global audience?
This is such a fantastic and complex question. So I think that it's incredibly important. So I think our biggest thing that orients all our work is what we want to do is we want to share. So we have 2 free classes that we've created as part of the book and that are out there on Coursera starting next week, I think, actually. And then on edX, free online classes that are available also on Columbia platforms. And one is called the Blended Learning Toolkit, and one is called Digital Case Method. So these are basically free courses that are designed to allow anybody around the world to use the same techniques that we have sort of developed ourselves or studied and copied from the best we could find around the world, and how to think about digital education, how to make online classes, how to make digital case studies. So our Digital Case Method class gives you exactly the recipe book. And again, young people today, they're all very digitally savvy. They just need a little help in thinking about narratives and storytelling. And that's what our class gives. And the goal is that that would empower universities around the world to create their own content. And I think, you don't want to reinvent. Think about the TED Talk.
Correct.
I think the TED Talk is the most clear example of the power of creating a format, empowering local creation, but then leaving the actual content, to the local people around the world. So a TED Talk created in Singapore, it has the same production values generally and content as one created in Italy or in Texas. And so that is incredibly empowering. So that's our model, is how can we create some other formats and empower people so that the content can be local, but it could be created in a way that's made to a universal standard and ideally shared on a platform where there's a mechanism for for curating it, because you can't just be putting anything out there. You need to be careful about that. So those are I think some of
Very,
the
very
basic.
interesting. Thank you. So I have time for two more questions for you. My next question is that what challenges do you foresee in the global expansion of digital education, especially in underserved regions?
Well, I think I think that the biggest challenge, I think, is going to be the recognition that this is really important, and that I think that the major funders are now understanding this, and I think that it's really a question now, actually, of universities, frankly, to step up and understand that all of our universities, sharing knowledge is in our mission statement. The reason for our existence is sharing knowledge. But generally, we focus on sharing knowledge more, I think, sometimes, in creating peer-reviewed academic articles. I think that perhaps universities could do more and play a bigger role in the changes that are going to be coming in the next, 20 years, by making a more concerted effort to share modular content and really get that out there. And I think that there were some big efforts to do that with the MOOC platforms, edX and Coursera. But frankly, the economics of it were such that edX is no longer a nonprofit. They were acquired by a private company, and Coursera was always a for-profit play. But so there's not really right now, and I think it's a huge space for a nonprofit, profit-driven entity that would share digital content. And I think that could play a huge role, because I think universities want to get it out there. When I talk to people, professors want to see their teachings shared. They want to empower local groups. And so I think that question of how can we create a platform for sharing content that would really allow local learning to happen.
Very, very interesting. And my last question to you, Adam, and given the incredible amount of research you and your co-authors have done in the area of digital education, I'm going to ask you to look at your crystal ball and tell me, what do you see as the future of digital education in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think it's going to be modular creation of assets and things that are created by students. Students, I think sometimes we get too proud. We think, we're Columbia University. We are, whatever place we are. We think I think we have to look and learn from the young people we're studying with us. And I think that we should. There's a lot that's happening that might not currently be situated in higher education space, but that's learning. It's happening in the corporate sector. It's happening in social media. So I think that if we are not too proud and look widely, we could learn a lot from these people. And then we could figure out how can we apply this not for commercial ends to sell gambling apps or whatever, but actually to share knowledge. And I think there's a lot that exciting things that are going to happen. So I think that AI is going to really drive modular sharing. I think a lot more people are going to realize that it's okay to teach a class, just like you're happy to teach a class and assign a chapter from someone else's book or a paper. You would also perhaps include in your thing a lecture by a fantastic professor from Indian Institute of Technology or somewhere who's really done a fantastic TED Talk style lecture on a certain issue. I think that's going to be very normal. And I think that's also going to allow a local professor to say, I'm going to create a class where I'm going to include a little bit of the world's most insightful things about whatever the issue, which very often might be small digital cases actually created by students, saying, here's a group of students in Bangladesh, and they've done a fantastic thing about global warming and its impact on a very specific local issue. I'm going to use that in my class. So that's what we see happening. And I think it's also going to be connected to the problems of the world. I think there's many, many big problems the world is trying to struggle to solve. There's so many smart people out there who are currently not in the discussion. So I think that those platforms will invite a lot of people to the table, as it were. And so those are some of the trends I'm hoping to see.
Fascinating. And on that note, Adam, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. I do completely agree and believe that digitization has empowered far more people in the world than ever before. Digital education has now started to reach millions and millions of people and really giving them the ability to have a voice and to express what they want. Thank you for speaking to me about a little bit about your book, Leveling the Learning Curve. And I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Adam Stepan's book, Leveling the Learning Curve. Thank you for speaking to me about so many different aspects of digital education. And thank you also for sharing so many of your different thoughts on different sensitivities that digital education would have on a global basis. Thank you again and good luck.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.